Okay. A very good morning to all of you. It is my great privilege to welcome Dr. Patrick Wooleen, who is a professor of sociology at UCLA. I'd like to introduce him before we begin the talk. Professor Huoleen's research lies at the intersection of demography and family sociology. He investigates how childhood family structures, such as single parenthood and cohabitation, affect child well-being and transitions to adulthood, with comparative work across Western countries. Since 2000, he has led a long-term project in Cambodia examining the demographic and familial consequences of the Khmer Rouge regime, including its death toll and intergenerational impacts. Professor Patrick also develops demographic models to understand population shocks, notably the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. His work blends rigorous methodological innovation with deep substantive engagement in global contexts. Without further ado, I welcome Professor Huoleen, who will speak on parental loss and mental health in post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia. Professor.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. So my presentation is three parts. I will first say a little about Cambodia and recent Cambodian histories, especially from the late 1970s. I realize I may not have to say as much here that I would to an American audience, but still, I'd like to bring up elements that I think will be relevant for my presentation. The second part would be about the data collection project that Christian's mentioned, that I've been conducting with my colleagues in Cambodia since 2000. And the third part would be, as my title today suggests, on mental health following the event of the 1970s in Cambodia. So I have a long list of collaborators on the data project that have helped me design the survey and collect the data. The third part is on mental health is a joint project with Angela Clegg, former student who is now at the RAND Corporation. So I want to acknowledge them all, although I don't have time to name them all today. So this is, I assume you're familiar with the location of Cambodia, between Thailand in the west, Laos in the north, and Vietnam in the east. And particularly relevant for my talk today will be this long border with Vietnam in the east, on the eastern side. And 2 weeks before a somewhat famous and dramatic departure of the U.S. Ambassador from Saigon, from the roof of the embassy, a group known as the Khmer Rouge entered the capital city of Cambodia, Phnom Penh. What is meant by this term Khmer Rouge? It's actually something like a nickname that the head of state of Cambodia, Norodom Sihanouk, who was head of state from the independence in 1954 to 1970, gave this this political group. They were initially the Communist Party of Cambodia, and Rouge in French means red, and Khmer is the main ethnic group of Cambodia at some time. But what it meant there was the communist Cambodian. And actually, during the time he was head of state, actually Sihanouk outlawed the Communist Party, and they became an underground guerrilla force. So when they entered Cambodia in 1975, it was a bit of a surprise. They were not that well known to the international community. Here's a time where probably taken sometime in the 60s, where they were this small guerrilla warfare group. This is on the trail. This is likely a stage photographs where on the left of the screen leading the march is Pol Pot. And the third person is his brother-in-law, Nguyen Xie, who was number two in the regime. This map shows in 1970 the most of the country in gray was controlled by the government, and the pockets that control the Khmer Rouge control were in red here, where they looked maybe sizable on the map, but they were very low density population areas, mountainous kind of jungle areas in the mountains both in the southwest and in northeast. The other notable feature is that in the late 60s, early 70s, the North Vietnamese army was controlling the area, was actually using the area in Cambodia to bring supply to the Northern Army, much to the frustration of the American were supporting the South Vietnamese army. And in 1970, President Norodom Sihanouk, former King Sihanouk, was trying to dance a difficult steps, trying to stay neutral between Vietnam and North Vietnam and the Americans, but wasn't able to prevent this. And he was again, he grew. The U.S. government got increasingly frustrated with him, and in 1970 there was a coup, and in which Sihanouk was replaced by Lon Nol, an army general who was much more who cooperated much more openly with the Americans. The involvement of the American government or CIA in the coup is a matter of debate, but what is clear is that that served the interest of the American better. And there's a couple of things that would happen in the next few years between 1970, this coup, and the map that you're seeing, and the Khmer Rouge taking the capital 5 years later. That explained the expansion of the Khmer Rouge forces. The first one is the fact that Sihanouk was deposed in the for a government in exile to restore his power. He went to China, and then China, which was one of the main supporters of the Khmer Rouge, engineered this very strange alliance between the Communist Party and a former king that became head of state. So in this picture, you see Sihanouk is the second from the right, and second to his left is Khieu Samphan, which was one of the leaders of the Khmer Rouge at the time. So that gave a big boost in popularity to the Khmer Rouge, because the Prince Sihanouk's former king was still very popular in the countryside. The second factor was that, as you may know, the American B-52 started to bomb that area at the border that I show you there to cut the supply routes of the North Vietnamese, and that, of course, was very unpopular in Cambodia. That led to a lot of refugees going to Phnom Penh, having to leave their village, entire villages being destroyed, and some people also joining the guerrillas, the guerrilla movement of the Khmer Rouge. So from a small, almost tiny, negligible force in 1970, we get to that moment where the Khmer Rouge enter Phnom Penh. And they establish a government called Democratic Kampuchea, the DK. And this is the flag of the new government. And the reason I'm showing this is that it really symbolizes two main components of their ideology and government, the red color for the communist government, and they will undertake a very dramatic type of social transformation and revolution that we'll describe in a few more a moment. And the second is the nationalist aspect. You see here in gold the profile of Angkor Wat, which was the height of a symbol of the height of the empire, the Khmer Empire. And so the Khmer Rouge were one trying to create a communist one-class society, try to eliminate social differences, but they were also trying to, in their discourse, wanted to return Cambodia to its past glory and being somewhat of a dominant force in Southeast Asia, which it's no longer was at the time. So here's and the group was fairly mysterious. People didn't really know who the Khmer Rouge were. They were often referred to as the Angkar, which means the organization. And here, I mean, many years after the fact, we can kind of reconstruct what the organization looked like. This is the head of state, Kyo Sampan, who you saw in the picture with Sihanouk previously. He was kind of the official front of the Cambodian government, was officially the head of state, but the real power again rested with Pol Pot, the chief executive, and his brother-in-law Nanchua, the chief of the legislative branch. The, the 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 regime lasted 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, not even for 4 years. And it ended with the entry into Cambodia of the Vietnamese army. Um, I don't want to go into too many details, but part of restoring the Khmer past glory was to try to recover some territories that had been in the Khmer Rouge ideology been taken over by Vietnam, and there were some small skirmishes at the beginning, and then it erupted in something bigger. And the Cambodian army was not no match for the Vietnamese army that had already fought was very well trained. I think fought the American for many years and being much better equipped. And when on the other side, the Khmer army was barely functioning. A lot of people were starving and etc. So what became clear as soon as the Khmer Rouge left was the massive death toll of the regime in only 4 years. Many people were killed or had died. Mass graves were uncovered pretty much throughout the countries. Um, and the reason from this are obviously the political violence. So in 1975, when they took over, the Khmer Rouge did execute and killed outright people who were associated with the previous regime of the Lon Nol government, who was um, associated with the American. They also skip ahead a bit. They also forcibly evacuated the cities, major cities, in particular Phnom Penh, which has, by some account, up to 2 million people because of the refugees that have come from eastern Cambodia, and some of them, the oldest and the youngest, didn't survive the long march. And many of the urban dwellers were sent to labor camp, a big project, again, part of the idea of returning to the past glory of the Khmer Empire was to build some dams, to reclaim some land over from the jungle, to add rice field and so on. And many urban dwellers were poorly fit for that type of work, and also the whole population was very poorly fed because this massive expansion of the agricultural production didn't materialize. So there was this, and there was also a lot of people who died of, let's say, malnutrition or just infection, medical neglect, because the public health and apparatus was entirely destroyed. There were also a number. My slide, I think, I slightly out of order, but I think I showed you before this slide. That is. Oh, okay. I'm going in the wrong direction. That's why. Okay. So there was also internal purges as the lofty goals that the Khmer Rouge at the higher levels were setting were not met. Instead of questioning their ambition, the Pol Pot and his top cadres started to question the dedication of lower cadres to the revolution. Many were brought to Phnom Penh for questioning and would never come back. So there's a number of reasons for the massive number of deaths. We don't really know how many people died during the time. What I call the death toll is the number of deaths in excess just during the period of the decay. That is just for those 3 years and nine months roughly. That is someone who could have died after the Vietnamese took over, but of wounds or malnutrition during that time are not counted in that number. But even with that somewhat restrictive definition of death toll, the range of estimates is very wide. In the literature, you find numbers as low as 700,000 or as high as 3.3 million. And this is kind of a mind-boggling in interval. And unlike this sentence from British novelist Margaret Drabble, kind of sums it up by it's one of her characters writing this in his journal when he's studying what went on in Cambodia. Between 1 and 3 million in Cambodia is a phrase that cannot exist. What kind of history, what kind of mathematics is this? I'm going to make a little detour because as a demographer, this is something that interests me quite a bit. Try to see if we can crack this down a little bit better. There's basically three ways that these estimates of from 700,000 to 3.3 million came to be. The first type is tallies of survivors reports, something like for demographers, something similar to the sibling survivorship methods, where you ask people how many siblings they had and how many survive, and those who died, did they die during that time? And usually, initially, that was carried on from very small, convenient sample, something like, the first was very difficult to go to Cambodia because they were still fighting between the Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge. So people did interviews at the border of refugees who were crossing into Thailand. So we know there's some biases. We have no idea how representative those small samples are of the whole population. Um, and then the government tried to do something much more massive about the survivors report, tried to do almost like a census, so people could go to different township in the country and report. And there, the difficulty is, how do you account for people being maybe reported multiple times by different siblings. So the 3.3 million figure, for example, was obtained in that way, and it's very likely to include many double counts. The second approach is a little bit more gruesome. It's actually conducting something like a census of the mass grave. So there was a project, I think, coordinated by the Yale Genocide Program to use satellite images to try to detect all the mass grave throughout Cambodia. And then for each of them, send a team of forensic experts to determine how many bodies there were there, what cause of death what cause was responsible for the death, and so on, and make an assessment. And this is also likely to be an undercount. There might be some misdiagnostic about the cause of death. I don't know how reliable forensic are, but you can imagine some of those were conducted quite a few years after the fact. And also, you never know if you had. There's likely to be bodies not in those mass graves. I mean, people talk about when they were living there, seeing people, bodies float on a river or a lake and so on. So it's likely that this is missing in some people, but we don't know. And then there's demographic reconstruction, which is that, if you have a data point before 1975 and one after 79, you can try to track the possible demographic path. Um, but this is also something that has a lot of uncertainty because in Cambodia, the only census they had was before 1975 was in 62. And if you try to reconstruct the population forward to 1979 when the Vietnamese came in, there's a lot of uncertainty of what fertility trends could have been, mortality trends could have been over a period of nearly 20 years. And the most recent data point after 79 was in 1992, the UN elections, electoral roster. And likewise, you can do backward projection, but you have quite a bit of uncertainty with so-called projection fans, so something well known to demographers. So the resulting estimate of excess deaths, which is kind of the residual in that demographic reconstruction, could be something relatively small if you take the lower bound of the forward projection and the upper bound of the backward projection, but it could be something much bigger if you do the opposite. So I did this type of reconstruction. The reason I still like this methods better than the other two is that at least it can give you what the other methods cannot give you is how reliable the estimates are, because you can actually quantify. You can go back here and you can actually simulate all the possibilities. There are many possibilities here. There's the whole universe, but you can define a probability distribution for that universe, and this is what this graph is showing you. Um, so unfortunately, there is so much unknown that if you use something that statisticians and social scientists like very much, which is this 95% likelihood interval, the death toll is still between 1.2 million and 2.8 million. So it's not much better than saying between 1 and 3. But it does allow you to almost rule out with almost near certainty some of the estimates that were either below 1 million or above 3 million, because you can show that the likelihood of that would be less than 1%. Um, and I think we can be a bit more realistic. There's so much uncertainty in this reconstruction that 95% is maybe not something we should really use, but we could be maybe slightly more modest and say, well, with a two-third likelihood, the death toll is between 1.5 and 2.25 million, something of that order. So this was a little bit an aside for those who are interested in formal demography and what it can contribute to the death toll. But I want to get back to what I will be talking about later, which is just the order of magnitude to get people's mind around this. The medium is about 1.9 million, a bit shy of 2 million, in a population of about 8 million. So if you count the population at risk, which is 1975 population, but also all the births during 75, 79, because the 1.9 million does include quite a bit of infant and child deaths. So you have to, either in the numerator, you have to put them in the denominator. You still get an estimate that is above 20% of the population that was at risk. So in a period of less than 4 years, that's a massive, massive death toll. So now I'm going to move to to the second part of my presentation, where we'll talk about data we started to plan in the late 1990s and started the first round of data collection in 2000, which was a collaboration with the Center for Pop Studies at the University of Phnom Penh, and it started in one single location. Because in the late 1990s, where we were starting to plan for this, there was still some fighting between the government forces and the Khmer Rouge, and also between two parts of the government. So there was actually a coup in 1997 where one side pretty much kicked the other one out of government, um, and um, and so a lot of I work with the main institution in this country, which was in Phnom Penh, and a lot of Phnom Penh residents didn't feel safe traveling very far away from the city. So we chose one area, um, which is obviously not nationally representative, but we chose one that was outside of the city and that we thought was somewhat an intermediate between the really far remote rural areas and the city center, because we know there was very strong, in that time, very strong gradient differences between urban and rural areas. Whatever indicator we looked at, literacy rates, education, socioeconomic status, and so on. So this is a picture of the Phnom Penh area. Here, Phnom Penh is an interesting location. It's often described as sitting on the side of an X. If you look at the major waterways, this side is the Mekong River, which goes like this, and just before Phnom Penh city, a major affluent river comes in. the and here the Tonle Sap, and then another one comes out, branches out just after Phnom Penh, and Phnom Penh is located here at the forearms of those riverways. And the area that we chose to study first from 2000 to 2006 was this island, which again was not far in terms of distance from Phnom Penh, but wasn't really that easy to get to. We first had to go. There was a bridge that was just constructed, but the Mekong didn't have any bridge, so we had to take ferries. And if your timing is good, you could make the trip in an hour, 15 minutes, but sometimes you just have to wait for the ferry to be full, and so it could be much longer. So this was really, even though very close to Phnom Penh, it was still a pretty rural areas. And so in connection with what we did from 2000 to 2006 and a later project is called, referred to as an health and demographic surveillance system. That is it's different from a survey where you do a random sample and you have uh, respondents scattered throughout the country. Here you choose one or several locations, and everyone in that location is part of the survey. And so they're registered at round one in what we call the benchmark or the census round, and then we register births, deaths, migration, marriages, divorce, and so on. And in connection with that, we did some what we call the writer surveys on specific topics we were interested in. One of them included the survival of kids and of parents. And we found that figure that out of those who had a father alive in 1935, 27% lost their father during the Khmer Rouge, and the proportion for mothers is 17%. It's shockingly high, but remember that it's for the whole population, so it's above 20% on average. And actually, adult males from the age of 25 to 65 were at higher risk of all. So this figure is actually is probably close to a national average at that point. Okay, so moving now to the final part of my presentation, and the main one, I want to talk about the consequences of for people who survive of losing a parent or both parents during that time. So there's a large literature on so-called ACE, the adverse childhood events, and what impact they have on outcome later in life throughout the life course. And of course, we can think of parental loss being one of them, and maybe one of the most impactful of them. And we can think of different channel mechanisms to that this would affect your health, your education, your social status, marital prospect in the long run. The first one is at the individual level, and I will call this the bereavement effect or impact. So you can think of the effect on educational attainment, for example, of a child who's affected by the death is not maybe focusing on unable to focus on his or her education. And this would be this channel here on the top of my of this graph on this framework. But there is also the impact on other household members, in particular the surviving parent, who might be affected in their own way. Either also as through bereavement, also if uh, the deceased parent was the main provider, the impact might be economic as well. So the household characteristic that are a contributor to the transition to adulthood of the child will also be impacted. And in some case, there's a third or alternative way. It's possible that the impact is such that the child would actually be fostered out, adopted by another, or fostered by another household. It's especially the case if both parents die. And and this may be somewhat better in terms of household characteristic that this household have, but also there's a wide literature on how parents allocate between biological children versus niece and nephews, or foster children that are not totally related to them in the same way. And so it's possible that the household characteristics are better, but the parent-child relationship is different and not as fewer of the resources of the household are actually directed toward that child. So we have this three type of effect that we can think of. So I would argue that the conceptual framework is very compelling. It's very likely that there are some effect. But the empirical side is actually, on the empirical side, it's a bit more difficult to isolate this effect and find some causal effect. And this has to do with selection, two types of selection. The first one is that in most settings, parental loss is a fairly rare event, fortunately, and that those means that those who are actually affected often come from backgrounds that are already at a disadvantage. So the difficulty becomes to tease out the disadvantage that preceded the parental loss and those that accumulated afterwards. Um, and the second difficulty is also a form of selection, but this time a form of positive selection. It is that the whole household that orphans that are fostered out might take, might move to, those are not also not randomly selected. In general, it would make sense that the household that take in those orphans are better off than average, so that there will be some selection. So that in the end, the conceptual framework that I showed you before has some alternative mechanism that makes the identification much more difficult. So I spent quite some time in the first part telling you about the 1970s in Cambodia to hopefully drive home the point that we may not think that losing a parent was as selective in Cambodia as it is in most other settings with low mortality. Again, 27% of the population losing a parent. That's not as rare, sadly, as it is elsewhere. And to some extent, it's even possible that if there was selection on family background, those who were better off might have been more likely to lose a parent because of the targeting of the Khmer Rouge by the Khmer Rouge of the former elite, former members of the former government. People were more educated. Although I think that even that form of selection is relatively weak because initially, maybe in 1975, just after the takeover, there was some very targeted form of executions and killing. Afterwards, I think the bulk of the deaths that I mentioned is actually due to lack of proper medicine, lack of proper diet, and excess work, which affected pretty much everybody at the time. So this actually, I would argue, may make the identification a bit easier because we don't have to worry too much about this selection into parental loss. But there's a number of factors that may also make the identification more difficult. Is that even people who did not lose a parent were also might potentially not bereaved but traumatized in some way. There's a fairly large literature that has documented PTSD in refugees from Cambodia. PTSD was identified and codified in the DSM manual of the American Psychology Association in 1980. And this corresponds to the time that some refugee was arriving in the US, and high prevalence of PTSDs were identified then those are not nationally representative samples. They're like samples of clients in clinics and so on. So it's highly selected, but the prevalence of PTSD, depressive disorder, was found in many samples in Long Beach, Portland, Salt Lake City, Montreal. And later, some studies were conducted in Cambodia where they found also high prevalence of PTSD and depression among the survivors. And even in a national survey, 3%, 3.3% exhibited likely PTSD and 18% likely depression. 3%, if you're not familiar with the literature on PTSD, that might not sound very high, but in the general population, it's usually less than a percent, 1%. So finding 3.3% in a random sample of the population, that's actually very high. So the difficulty that we are going to face in our context is that mental health issues might come from bereavement, but might come from other sources as well, and they're going to mediate any type of effect on the future life course outcome. So here is my revised contextual framework for this study. This is what we've seen before. There is still the possibility of positive selection into better household for fostered children. I'm less worried about this negative selection into parental loss, but I have to account for an alternative way that mental health can be affected by a traumatic experience and PTSD. So, yeah, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. All right, so we continue I described what we did from 2000 to 2006 in one single location. In 2008, with more funding, were able to expand to six areas still located along the Mekong River, but from the southern border near Vietnam, three here around Phnom Penh, and then two a little bit more up to the northeast. And those were, the color on that map are literacy rates. So those are generally not in the worst location in terms of literacy rate. These are rates of deaths, mortality rates that are calculated from the mass grave project I mentioned. So they're kind of average here in that region, not in the worst. And altogether, we have about 10,000 households and 50,000 people that we followed from 2008 to 2014. And at round one on this benchmark census where we register everybody, we identify orphans by asking question about surviving parents. And if someone is defined as an orphan if they lose one of their parents before the age of 20. And if they lose both of them, we call them bilateral orphans. And then in some of the later update, we do some kind of assessment, so socioeconomic well-being, physical health, mental health, and we oversampled our orphans to have, in the end, about 2,500 orphans and 1,500 non-orphans as a comparative group. I think we have about 600 maternal orphans, 600 bilateral orphans, and the rest, 1,400 paternal orphan, on which we had to sample because we had I think up to 4,000 initially. And then we used some instruments that have been designed out of the US, the Hopkins symptom list, which has 25 symptoms, 10 for anxiety and 15 for depression, and the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, which has questions both on exposure to trauma, traumatic experiences, and traumatic symptoms. And this, in particular, because these questionnaires have been translated in different languages, including in Khmer, and they've been tested. And the Khmer version has actually 40 exposure questions and 40 symptoms. And they have been used in many countries, and many people are claiming that they are widely valid outside of the US. This isn't without challenge. Some people are questioning those results, and especially whether the way they're formulated. I mean, especially symptoms, whether they're actually culturally sensitive in the sense of catching the way that actually people would express those symptoms. And so, if not, there could be both false positive or false negative. That is, people might be traumatized but don't fit any of the criteria of symptoms that are used in the questionnaire, or on the opposite, could be displaying behavior that are seen as symptomatic but actually are somewhat adaptive in the context. There's a fairly wide literature that on this. So our question, I mean, we tested those instruments, and our skepticism was less about the cultural sensitivity than about the literacy requirement of those surveys. I mean, we even when we were doing trainings. And we were looking at the translation, it was sometimes difficult for me to really explain the subtlety of the 40 different symptoms. I'm just going to take one example. One of them is having difficulty to pay attention, and another one is having a difficulty concentrating. And I must admit that I'm, I'm fairly fluent in English, but I'm not exactly sure how to explain the difference between the two to a fairly low literacy rural population. And the second concern was that the mental health questionnaire was only part of one of uh, three questionnaires that we were administering, and we didn't want the questionnaire to go on for more than 2 hours. So we made some cuts, and we only used about half of the items on the list, 17 of the HTQ experiences, 21 of the symptoms, and 18 of the Hopkins scale. And we also use one question that is a self-rated question that was developed through our focus group, where we simply ask people, well, how would you say in Khmer that you are either that your mental health is bad or your physical health is bad, and we came up with this five category, which were like one to be comfortable or in good health, which the word in Khmer translate as easy. You're easy. You're good. The second, kind of the opposite, is to be in pain. So this is more like physical pain. The third one is indifferent, which means neither good or bad, but also could mean a bit detached and not engaged. And happy, sad, which is fairly straightforward. So now I'm going to turn to, sorry, in about 10 minutes I have left, I'm going to turn to the main results that we have. And here I show the proportion having experienced some of the traumatic experiences by cohort. I have four cohorts. The one in gray is the 75 to 78. Those are the people who were born during the Khmer Rouge. The yellow bar is those who were born afterwards. The orange one, 61 to 74, those are people who were under the age of 15, so they were the most likely to lose a parent during that time. And then older cohorts are in blue. What we find here is something we kind of expected, which was a gradient that there would be less. I mean, this type of pattern between the three here, there would be less experience of those traumatic experiences for the younger cohort, but we didn't expect. But first, the gradient is not that strong. I mean, it's pretty high in every group, and also it's especially in those who were born after the Khmer Rouge, and that was somewhat unexpected. Although ex post we could rationalize this by saying, well, even today, Cambodian society is a fairly violent society. I mean, in terms of political regime, you might know that killings are not rare. Political violence is pretty common, unfortunately. But also, we can think here of the intergenerational transmission of trauma. We know that domestic violence is very high. Parenting styles can be pretty harsh, and physical punishment is still pretty common. So to talk about having been deprived of something, and a lot of people have experienced some food scarcity. So to be deprived of food, some of these the question about experiences, traumatic experience, are in four categories. Deprivation can refer to something like not having enough food and going to bed hungry. Life-threatening is seeing something that where you thought you might die. Abuse, physical abuse or mental abuse, or even murdering, witnessing murder. So we know we have this variation in exposure, and we also have this variation that is consistent in the main symptoms of anxiety, depression, or any of the symptom and even sadness. So the pattern by cohort is pretty clear and much as we expect. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk also about PTSD. We have different definition. Here is the full definition, which is to have experience. Again, PTSD symptoms are also categorized, I think, in four groups, A, B, C, D. And to have full PTSD, you have to experience symptoms from, I think, A, B, and C or D. Not exactly sure, but something like this. And so if we do that, we have about 2% of the population. Because we reduce the number of questions, we were worried that we might not have, we might miss. So we also look in the literature. There's some partial PTSD definition, one that is somewhat stringent and increase the prevalence to 4%, and one that is more lenient, increase the prevalence to 12%. So we were hoping that maybe by using this lenient definition with 12%, we will get more, better analysis than just looking at a very tiny 2% share of the population. So the results are, then we looked at the predictors of both traumatic experiences and symptoms by and control for gender, marital education, marital status, education, cohort, and province, since we have 6 different locations. And for the exposure, we did find that bilateral orphans, so who lost both parents, had significantly more exposure to abuse. Unfortunately, we don't have the timing of the abuse. We didn't ask follow-up question about when it was. And so you can think of, well, those who lost both parents, they might have been really targeted and really at the time, just before the death of their parents, been really exposed to, or just after severe abuse, or it could be the result of being in another household and not protected by their adoptive parents as well as biological children. We can't tell that. When we look at the mental health issue, we find here too, we look at both sadness and depression. The results are a bit clearer for depression, but they're very similar for the two. So I'm going to mention this. So we see a big effect of having experienced any traumatic experience, especially form of abuse. So we know that our bilateral orphans are in that category, but it doesn't. But bereavement, having lost a parent, is not significant in this model. Once we have control for abuse, they are at higher likelihood of abuse. But once we control for that, they're not more likely to experience depression or sadness. It's mostly the cohort pattern that is visible here, where those were born before 1960 or between 60 and 75 are more likely to experience depression or sadness than those that are born after the Khmer Rouge. For PTSD, the results are a bit different. The pattern by cohort is not that strong, but we find some strong result for orphans. Of course, exposure is a big part of the story again. If you have witnessed murder or any traumatic experience, you're much more likely to have PTSD, which is fully consistent with the literature. And here in this graph, I showed the two definition of the full definition of PTSD and the most lenient one. And I was telling you we were hoping that with using a more lenient definition with more people, we'll be getting better results, and that didn't work out. Actually, it's not saying that the full definition is better, but actually it seems to be more precise at capturing the effect. Maybe the other one is just too noisy a measure to do that. And the main result is for orphans that the missing category here is paternal orphan. And maternal orphan are very similar to paternal orphan. And we find if we look at the non-orphan that they are more likely to have PTSD than the non-orphan. But the other surprising result, and that's going to be the last one, is that for bilateral orphan, they're also less likely than single, paternal or single maternal orphan to have PTSD once we control for the exposure. So they're more likely to be exposed to abuse, but once we control for traumatic experience, they actually do better. I mentioned this when I was talking about the graph. So our conclusion is that, or yeah, provisional conclusion is that we did find the expected cohort patterns, and we found that they are really important to, especially with respect to cohort, to explain anxiety and depression. But when we look at PTSD, we have strong effect for losing a parent. And the result for bilateral orphan is consistent with what I mentioned initially in my graph, that it could be the positive selection. So bilateral orphans are more exposed, more potentially traumatized by the experience they have, but then they move to a house that is maybe better off, and in terms of socioeconomic status, and then they have, once we control for the exposure, less likely to suffer than um, paternal or maternal orphan with the same level of exposure. Another explanation that has been that we thought of is also the by for paternal or maternal orphan, one of the issue is also the parenting. The remaining parents might be traumatized themselves, and there might be more transmission of PTSD intergenerationally than in the case of bilateral orphans that are removed from their parents. And this is something that we also will be consistent with some of the literature. So I wanted to leave some time for, I've been a bit fast at the end, but I wanted to leave time for a question. So I'm just going to mention very briefly that the 2000 to 2006 data are available from ICPSR. The 2008 14 have been submitted to ICPSR. They're currently under review, but they should be available shortly. And so I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take a few questions. I'll let Christy monitor the flow.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. Of course, there's a lot of pain in here. Just listening
Yeah.
to the history of trauma that these population has experienced, it's just remarkable. So thank you very much for not only capturing it, but also sharing with us, the data and the challenges that you faced. Now the floor is open for questions. Um, Please, if you would like, you can turn on your camera, introduce yourself, or just ask the question, or even post it in the chat box. Please raise your hand. Okay, Pook. We were just talking about you before the talk. Hi, Pook.
Hi, hello.
Hello.
Sorry. Okay. My quick question, I'd like you to help elaborate a little bit more on this secondary traumatization. Whether or not is it possible to measure based on the data that you have? And I mean, you said one of the explanation is that the non-bilateral orphans are less likely to experience PTSD because, you know, are more likely to experience
Yeah.
PTSD because of the mothers, right? Or the surviving parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if, but I don't know, it seems like have you tried to measure secondary traumatization? Or And if the data allow you to do so, because it seems like the data is very rich. And by the way, I really enjoy your talk.
No, thank you.
Sorry for
Um,
not being so coherent.
yeah, no, thank you very much. Um, so, so we haven't, this, to be honest, this is not an hypothesis we had. Maybe we should have thought about this before. Um, but this is something we read in the literature. I mean, there's studies again of PTSD in the diaspora that also show that there is some kind of, and I think in other settings too, that show that there are some, I mean, maybe the term transmission is too strong because it may sound a bit like deterministic, but that there is a higher risk of PTSD among children of PTSD sufferers. And this isn't something we had really in mind. I show you the framework that we were using.
Mhm.
So to answer your question, we might kind of be lucky and have some parents and children in the sample, but it's not something we've looked at. And we didn't really design it this way. So usually we would have one person, and we have some siblings. So one thing that we have not yet looked at, but that was part of the initial design, was to compare. We have sibling pairs among the respondents to the mental health questionnaire. And some of the sibling pairs are true biological siblings, and some are what we call social siblings. So they are the biological children of the foster parents, and that was by design. We wanted to check that the effect of being a biological or non-biological child of the head of the household. And so we by design we took some group, and we wanted that would kind of control for household characteristics, see if there's a separate effect of that. So um, we might have some actual, and we might have some biological siblings in there, and that might help. We might look at, I mean, if you're more likely to have PTSD, if you have a sibling with PTSD, that would kind of be suggestive, I think,
Mhm.
of some intergenerational transmission.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's not as neat a design as I would hope to if I were to do a study today.
Thank
Um,
you.
Okay,
and I mean, we did have a project. I mean, we do have we did intend whether it would be possible to get funding for this or not. Well, remains to be seen. But where we were actually interested in looking at children at parents and children, especially those who were born during the Khmer Rouge. And in that design, if that comes to be, then we might be able to look at this.
Yeah, I have a quick clarification questions. When you said social siblings, are they cousins? Like the foster parents, are they usually relatives?
So again, this is not something uh, I've dug into yet. I would suspect so. So what we do is we have at round one we have those people who are identified or as orphan, and round three we ask this questionnaire. Round two in between we ask them for residential history after the death of their parent, and
Mm-hmm.
then for each of the household in which they live, we ask them to give us a list of the household resident, including children. And because in this context, in many of these village, people tend to remain locally, we
Mm-hmm.
were able to identify some of those biological children that were named by the by the respondent. And so we haven't looked at the nature of the relationship too. I think that's something I'm actually quite interested in.
Yeah.
But I would say the most from what I believe from what we got from qualitative data in when we were planning for this, we did some focus group. The most common, I mean, the preferred way would be a grandparent if they're still alive. And the second would be uncle or aunt, and without preference on either side, apparently. So yeah,
Thanks.
so I think you're right. There would be a fair amount of cousin in there if the foster is a uncle and pair. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, as we wait for other questions, I have a few of my own. So, Patrick, did you capture any biomarker that sort of captures stress experienced by these?
Right. So a big part of the follow-up that we wanted to do was on biomarkers, because we wanted to see the physical impact of having been in the developmental years. I mean, what we often refer as the first 1,000 days, either in vitro, in utero, or in less than two. I mean, the first 2 years of life, basically.
Mhm.
Again, if everything goes well, invite me again in 5 years, and I'll have a lot more on biomarkers. But in this one, we did have a little bit. We had height, weight, and some measure, I believe, waist circumferences, a few like this. But we didn't have any of the what we were proposing to do in the follow-up, which would be like dry blood spot and things where you can actually test for some
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
um, specific yes biomarkers. But we have biometric, I would say, measurement rather than
Hmm.
the
Biometric.
biomarkers that you may have in mind. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, thank
So we
you.
could still look at height and things like this that would
Right.
probably correlate with deprivation, for
Hmm.
example, nutrition and
How
but
about,
stress also to some extent.
yeah. How about blood pressure?
Um, I don't think so. I think that was in 2019. That's when we did the pilot for
Hmm.
this and where we did the dry blood spot and blood pressure.
Hmm.
And again, our timing wasn't great. Our pilot was in 2019, and then it was COVID, so we had to
Yeah,
stop for a few
that's
years. And then when we resubmitted, we were not successful in the first try, and now
understood.
we are kind of waiting to see what the funding situation would be in
Hmm.
the US to see if we will resubmit or not.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yes,
Um,
the this is actually the I see at the bottom of my thank you note the USC UCLA Center on Biodemography was actually funding that testing.
oh, okay. Oh, great. And in the analysis, did you find any gender differences?
Yes, yes, I didn't mention them too much, but they were I think it's fairly common um, to see here that to find that the male are usually less
Hmm.
likely to suffer from depression, sadness, given abuse, but could be difference in reporting too.
Hmm.
We're not really sure, but yeah, male are reporting fewer depression, sadness, and it's also PTSD symptoms.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, we still have room for questions. Okay. So if since we don't have any questions, I would like take this opportunity to thank Professor Heveline for being here today and sharing his insightful study and findings. Thank you so much for doing this important work. Uh, we learned a lot.
Well, yeah, again, I want to thank you for inviting me, and I know that I went through quite a bit in a short period of time. So if anyone has need times to process and comes up with question later on, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to continue the conversation over email if anyone wants to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I let you go, I do have an announcement about the next talk, which will be an in-person talk at CFPR. Um, sorry, I just have to pull it up. I lost that. Just a moment. Yes, it is on low fertility and gender relations in East Asia, a comparative perspective on Japan and South Korea by Dr. Misei Sasano from Ibaraki University. This is on the 13th of November and will be an in-person talk. So thank you so much for everyone, to everyone for being here, and thank you again, Professor. We are very grateful
Thank
for your
you,
time.
and have a good rest of your day. Mine is almost over, but
Yes, good night.
all
Um,
right, take care.
yeah, thank you so much. All right.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.